Okay, we are going to get started. Thank you for your patience this morning. Welcome to Teaching Archival Research Methods Through Projects in Ethnohistory. We are excited to welcome our 4 panelists who are joining us from Rhode Island, Missouri, and Alaska, where it is very early. So thank you to Arlene and Alex for joining us. So during the spring semester of 2015 and the fall semester of 2016, 2 cohorts of students at the University of Alaska Anchorage learned archival research skills as part of their methodological training in the course Ethnohistory of Alaska Natives, which subsequently led to the development of further individual research projects. As part of the course, students provided metadata to folders within an archival collection. This presentation, based on an article published in the Journal of Western Archives, and the link to which you can find in our CIMA program, explores the semester-long projects, including the hardships of finding and using culturally appropriate metadata, lessons learned, and the impact the project had on students, archivists, and the archivist and the instructor. And our presenters are also going to reflect on how the project has since influenced their work. So I'm going to turn the time over to them to introduce themselves. And please feel free to put for those online, please feel free to put any comments in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll have some time at the end for question and answer.
Okay, good. Okay, no more echo. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Veronica Dennison. At the time, when we did the project, I was an archivist at the UAA APU Archives and Special Collections. And then when the article was published on the project, I was the University Archivist at Kansas State University. And now I am the Digital Archivist and Special Collections Librarian at Rhode Island College, where I manage the archives. I would like to acknowledge that Rhode Island College is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. I also would like to acknowledge that while she is not presenting with us today, Alyssa Willett is a co-author on the article that was published in Journal of Western Archives and was the graduate student working with cohort 1. Okay, next slide.
Thank you. My name is Medha Chapati-Has. At the time when we were working on the course, teaching the course, I was an assistant professor of anthropology and Alaska Native Studies at the University of Alaska Anchorage. While we were writing the article, I was an instructor of anthropology at the Des Moines Area Community College, and currently I'm an associate professor of geography at the University of Missouri. This morning, I'm calling in from Columbia, Missouri. That is the traditional homelands of the Osage Nation, the Ottawa, Missouri, Kikapoi, Illini, Iowa, Arbahoje, Sauk, Meskwaki, and Quapaw people, and many other nations who have traveled through the landscape and waterways of this area. And the next slide, please.
Good morning. My name is Alex Tate. I'm joining from Dena'ina Athleta in Anchorage, Alaska, and thank Eklutna Dena'ina and all Alaska Native peoples for their past, present, and future stewardship of the land, waterways, and plants here in the place that I call home. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in Digital Heritage Preservation and the Assistant Curator of Digital Content and Programs at the Anchorage Museum. At the time of this project, I was a master's student in anthropology at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I look forward to being here with you all this morning. Next slide.
Good morning. I am Arlene Schmuland. I am head of Archives Special Collections at the UAA APU Consortium Library, now and then. I live and work on the traditional current and future homeland of the Eklutna Dena'ina. Next slide, please.
All right. We also would like to do a land acknowledgement for the collection that we will be talking about and that the students worked in. The Charles Dussier papers contains traditional knowledge and ancestral material, heritage of several Alaska Native communities, cultures, and people, including Yupik, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Inupiaq, Unungan, Alutiiq, Tlingit, and Haida. Their traditional homelands and waterways of Alaska Native cultures and people in the Arctic and subarctic regions span several contemporary countries, including the United States, Russia, and Canada. Next slide. All right. So in the spring 2015 and the fall semester of 2016, 2 cohorts of students at the University of Alaska Anchorage learned archival research skills as part of their training in the course Ethnohistory of Alaska Natives, which was taught by Maida, who is with us today. Both cohorts worked in the Charles Lucier papers. So some background on Charles Lucier. Charles Lucier came to Alaska and studied at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. After serving in World War II at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, Lucier was an apprentice of Otto Geis in his Pleistocene faunal collections. Anthropologists Ivor Scarland and J.L. Giddings Jr. selected Lucier to assist Helga Larsen in an archaeological survey on the Seward Peninsula from 1950 to 1952. Lucier studied Alaska Native culture and house ruins at Kotzebue Sound and did a field study of the culture of the Noatak Inupiat in 1952. In the course of his field study, Lucier collected traditional Inupiat spoken knowledge and recorded music. He was also involved in recording folklore in the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, and Kotzebue Sound regions. In the mid-1950s, Lucier married Grace Nagazaruk, who was from Wales, Alaska. He then worked as a game biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game until he retired in the mid-1970s. Lucier was a member of the Cook Inlet Native Association and founding member, traditional drummer, and singer of Urban Natives United, which was a traditional Inupiaq and Yupik dance group. Charles Lucier died in 2013. His obituary stated that his family wrote this. He taught his children an appreciation of and their place in the natural world, pride in their Inupiat heritage, and perseverance over the human condition in physical and emotional adversity. The image on this slide is a profile view of Charles Lucier wearing a headdress. The caption of the photograph reads, photo taken by Art Kennedy on CL, Charles Lucier's camera, Dan's headdress, made jointly by John A. Cockrook and C. Lucier. John made the wings and harness. Lucier made the head and base and assembled the entirety. So the head base of Baleen, the native tanned caribou leather and wings, a favorite dance piece worn by Ben Snowball in 1970 in Seagull Dance. And I believe it was Charles Lucier who wrote that caption. Next slide, please. So the Lucier papers consist of archaeology and anthropology related papers, correspondence, personal and family papers, as well as photographs, transparencies, slides, postcards, and audio recordings of Alaska Native songs, dances, and biographies. On this slide is a photograph of Della Keats, who was an Inupiaq healer and midwife who practiced as an Inupiaq tribal doctor. A summer bridge program and summer research program at the University of Alaska Anchorage are named in her honor. And in this photograph, Della Keats is working with caribou hides. This photograph is from the collection, and the collection also includes several recordings of her autobiography, as well as translated stories and other materials from Della. Next slide. The archaeology and anthropology related papers include notes, lists, and drawings, articles, and drafts of articles which Lucier authored, co-authored, or with which she was otherwise involved, and an unpublished manuscripts Lucier edited of John Cockrook's life and stories as a reindeer herder. It's important to note that Lucier was not a traditionally educated anthropologist or archaeologist in like the more traditional sense. Apart from the materials dated to the early 1950s when he was on an archaeological dig on the Seward Peninsula, many of the other items in the collection, including several of the oral histories, the indigenous stories, correspondence, and recordings of the songs and dances are dated beyond that. Lucier's wife, Grace, was an Inupiaq woman, and many of the individuals reflected in this collection were relatives or friends of the Luciers. And when I spoke with the Lucier's daughter, she said his work allowed her to connect with her Inupiaq heritage. Many of the oral histories and stories were written and translated by Inupiaq individuals. This specifically is what sets this collection apart from other papers of Alaskan anthropologists. On this slide, we have little photographs of ethnographic notes from Kotzebue that were in Charles Lucier's collection. One of the images is of Inupiaq and English words, and the middle image is just a photo of what one of his ethnographic journals looks like. And then there's also a draft article on beluga hunting in Shishaluk. Next slide, please. So when Maida initially approached the archives about wanting to do a project with one of our collections, one that the students could learn a great deal from, and a project that could also benefit the archives in a way, I decided that the Charles of Sears papers would be pretty perfect for this. The collection was initially a legacy collection. I believe it was described around 2000, 2001 initially. So I ended up converting it to current archival standards, and I heavily updated the finding aid and described a 7 cubic foot addition to the collection. Because of my work in the collection, I knew there was a wealth of information. We also had received several reference requests from members of the Inupiaq community and students at UAA. So in discussion with my colleagues at the archives, we all agreed that this would be a great collection that could benefit from further description, which this description would include adding the names of individuals and the subjects in the field journals and notes, correspondence, manuscripts, oral histories, and genealogies. We also thought that including the titles and subjects of the traditional stories mentioned in the collection would also be beneficial. We believe that this project would help make the collection more discoverable to the Indigenous communities Lucia worked with and help the students learn about the complexities of archival research. So this slide has an example of what box 1, folder 1 initially was described as, so field journal and transcription college in Port Clarence, Alaska. Next slide. And then this is another example of what some of the folders looked like before. So box 7, folders 43 and 44 were labeled stories, and box 8, folder 43, folder 44, and folder 45, all different ethnographic notes with the individual associated with those. So ethnographic notes Flora Penn, ethnographic notes Jesse Ralph, and ethnographic notes Ina Tippelman, copy of 1951 original. So this was pretty common for how we would describe collections at UEA, just a nice folder level listing, not going really in depth into description within the finding aid because we didn't have the time for that. But next slide, please. So the project was completed in 2 different semesters, the spring of 2015 and the fall of 2016. The students were in the archives for about 3 hours a week working within various boxes within the collection. Between 1 and 3 students worked in each box. And they recorded the subjects, geographic places, corporate names, and people, as well as a summary of what was in each folder. For the first cohort, the collection was essentially divided into categories, and the students were assigned to those categories, which were field notes and journals, correspondence, stories, genealogy, ethnographic notes. However, the students in the second cohort were assigned specific boxes and folders, so they'd be working with different types of materials, which allowed them to learn more from the collection than, say, students from the first cohort, specifically who were working with the correspondence, that the correspondence really bogged some of the students down in the first cohort. In the first cohort, we had them use a metadata template that was available both digitally and paper-based, which was just rows and columns of different metadata fields that they would be collecting. And so they'd enter the folder information into that template. Then the template was sent to the graduate student, who was Alyssa, who's not here with us today. And Alyssa would review that template, and then the information was added into the folder list in the finding aid. This was incredibly labor intensive, and oftentimes information wouldn't be entered into the finding aid until 3 weeks after it was initially gathered. So it was hard to keep track of things in real time. So for the second cohort, we created a Google Doc, and the students just entered the information right in there, which allowed us to really track the students' work to make sure everything was going well. Next slide. So cohort 1 had 14 students. They were in the archives for 233 combined hours and described 85 of 674 folders. And cohort 2 had 22 students. They were in the archives for about 325 combined hours and described 189 of 674 folders. Next slide. So this is an example of what box 1, folder 1 looks like now. So it still says field journal and transcription, college in Port Clarence, Alaska, but now there's a little bit further description, which says field notes recording Alaska Natives, Northern Alaska, Inupiaq, archaeological sites, mounds, burials, ivory carving, ivory, rock art, influenza, and tuberculosis. Larson and Lucier talk with many Native informants to help them find sites. Lucier describes the first time he encounters human burials. It also mentions the people. Helga Larson, Froelich Rainey, Joe Comic, James Picknellook, Ralph Alexander, Eric Holtfed, Owen Rye, Jack Bullock, Bert Eakin, and the Alana family. And then the place names that were covered in this journal, which are College, Port Clarence, through Peninsula Nome, and Point Hope. And we tried to leave the place names specifically to Alaska names. Next slide. So now box 7 folders 43 and 44 are 2 separate folder entries in the finding aid. So now with the story titles, it is The Cottonwood Tree, Alagasiak, Kupkak, Rags to Riches, Killer Whales and Wolves, The Blind Young Man, and the Loon, Burned Hillside, Spotted Wolverine, Raven Attacks, Raven and a Human Being, The First Fox Drum. And these were titles that are within the documents themselves within the folders, not ones that the students came up with. Next slide. And now the ethnographic notes also have more description. So one example is box 8, folder 43, and the graphic notes, Laura Penn. Notes in English and Inupiaq detailing Northern Alaska native ethnotechnology, manners and customs, reindeer food drying, food storage, buildings, foraging, fishing, hunting, shamans, storytelling, and spiritualism. And the place names Noatak, Sisulik, Kotzebue, Noatak River, Shishuluk, and Kivalina. So many of the students had questions regarding the metadata, especially around the outdated Library of Congress terms. I remember one student really asking about the usage of heaven for afterlife. And as the semesters went on, the students were using more of the words in the physical documents instead of the Library of Congress subject headings and thesaurus of graphic materials, which does seem more appropriate, right? I mean, many of the documents were written by Inupiaq or translated from Inupiaq to English. However, those documents still had Inupiaq terminology because there's no English equivalent. And so the students were using some of the names and phrases in the documents, and which reflects the way that these topics and subjects are discussed within that community. Sometimes an individual would have only one name or have an English name and an Inupiaq name, so then both would end up being reflected in the description. All right, next slide.
So now I would like to share a few reflections from the instructor perspective. First of all, I knew going into the project that I would like students to work extensively with archival material, but the goal of the course at the end of the day was for them to learn about ethnohistory and to do ethnohistorical research. And this is a complex task, and I needed to consider and balance several of elements that went into teaching ethnohistory. It involves an educational trajectory that guides students in becoming familiar with the new research methodology, ethnohistorical research, but also a new research resource, archival collections. So but archival research is only one aspect of doing ethnohistorical work. So I needed to consider the research skills that students were already bringing to the course. In this particular case, I knew I was offering this through anthropology, and so it was reasonable to expect that most students will come either archaeological or ethnographic research skills already, and they will bring that to the course. And this is actually the case. But teaching this course also needed to build on these research skills and then provide an engaged learning experience. So teaching it would have been different for, if I developed a course for history majors, it would have looked different, because then I would have had to emphasize teaching them about ethnographic skills and ethnographic research. At the same time, the course also needed to cover introductions to what ethnohistory is and teaching about Alaska Native cultures and people, so that the students could go into the archive and understand and be able to contextualize the data that they found in this particular archival collection. So at the end of the day, using the metadata tagging approach was actually very successful. It helps students become comfortable with archival collections and also allowed them to go through this process when they intuitively switched over from doing from metadata tagging to actually doing the ethnohistorical research. And this happened at different times for different students. So because we had this flexibility, we were able to provide this timeline for them that they could actually make the switch on their own when they were ready. The key was to guide and support them in developing this intuitive process and recognizing, documenting, and analyzing archival research data. And then when that happened and they started producing research data, then we actually weren't ready for the volume of the data that started forthcoming. This was a difficult task to teach because it was almost like doing ethnohistorical research backwards. Normally, we would have a question and then we would start looking at the collection and then use that data, analyze it to answer that question. But here in the class, looked at the data and then pulled out research topics and themes. And then they centered those during their work while still keeping in mind that they were representing and working with Indigenous data. Can I have the next slide, please? And then can you please also click it one more time so we have a map? Thank you. I would like to continue sharing some basic information about Alaska Native communities that would help contextualize our upcoming discussion on working with communities. We are looking at the Alaska Native Language Map by ANLC, the Alaska Native Language Archives from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The light blue colored coastal regions highlight Inupiaq, Yupik, and Sopiaq communities, and the green regions are Unangan communities, all of whom share a language family. In the interior, so the red and brownish color in the interior, all language families within the larger Dene language family, or languages within the larger Dene language family. And down on the what we call the Panhandle of Alaska, we have Eyak or the Hunkil, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian communities. About 40% of all federally recognized tribes are in Alaska. So, 40% of the countries, the nations of federally recognized tribes are in Alaska. And currently this is 228 tribes with over 180,000 enrolled tribal members. This roughly translates to about every fourth child in Alaska K-12 system having Alaska Native heritage. And this fact spurs corporations to invest in heritage preservation and educational programs. In Alaska, we have only one reservation, Metlakatla, and otherwise, due to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, we have regional and village corporations. So tribal members are usually, but not always, are enrolled in both regional corporations and village corporations. And so the regional corporations, can I get one more click, please, to bring up another map? Thank you. So you're looking at, from the MPS, you're looking at a map of the regional corporations, the areas they cover. We also have a +1 corporation that's for folks who lived in the lower 48 when ANCSA was happening. But we also have village corporations, over 200 village corporations that people are enrolled at. That being said, in addition to the corporations, we also have local councils, and this can be a traditional council or an IRA council, an Indian Reorganization Act council. So navigating these Alaska Native organizations can be challenging in how they relate to each other, and making sure that we contact everyone when we're starting a project or working on a project that would relate to those communities. Can I have one more click, please? Thank you. So we're going back to the ANLC map, and we circled the areas of Alaska that are mainly represented in the Lucier collection. So these are mostly St. Lawrence Island communities, Yupik communities, and Inupiaq communities. One more click, please. Next slide. Thank you.
Great. I was a grad student in the second cohort of this project. The first half of the semester was very dense with readings about what ethnohistory is and how to do ethnohistorical research. And then towards the second half of the semester, we transitioned to the project-based portion and met nearly every class at the UAA Archives and Special Collections. Here, each student was assigned boxes and folders based on their individual research projects and interests, in hopes that data collected from the archives could benefit their work outside the classroom. And while this didn't always happen, it was a big time commitment for our professor and archival staff to dedicate to try to find relevant information, but one that was greatly appreciated. Some of the challenges faced in the course, from my perspective, centered around just doing archival work in general. At the beginning, I personally lacked confidence in my ability to ensure I was describing the contents of the collections in the right way. Balancing research note-taking styles with specific format and content needs for the finding aid was a major learning curve. And another challenge that I encountered was, for lack of a better word, calling it the telephone effect when it came to documenting this Indigenous knowledge in the finding aid. So here I was reading notes from Lucier that he had written down from interactions and observations with Indigenous peoples of Western Alaska. And I wondered just how much would be lost in that documenting process as I became another step in the line of telephone from what was originally said or done. This anxiety was present throughout, but in the long run, I reminded myself of how the work that we were doing as a class was making the collection more accessible. Next slide, please. Looking back now as a museum professional, I see even more value in the class than when I was a grad student taking it. First and foremost, this project was far more than just a class assignment. By reading through lines and lines of cursive and drawings and scribbles in the corners of notebooks, we were fleshing out a finding aid that would prove to mean the difference in making the collection more accessible to Indigenous communities and the broader research community in general. Additionally, the practical experience of going into an archive, for some of us the very first time, and learning how to do archival research in a supportive environment was transformational. Without this class, I would not have had the same level of confidence to go into other archives if it weren't for the support and assistance of the archival team at UAA. Projects like these also demonstrate how archival collections can play such a major role in heritage preservation. There's a wealth of knowledge in these collections, and encouraging researchers to sift through the contents can help add contextualization and produce new leads in the field. Next slide.
The collection came in 54 separate accessions. 50 between 1984 and 2002, primarily in groupings of one folder to a half cubic foot, most just one folder at a time. That added up to about 6 cubic feet, initially described very minimally at folder level. The biggest chunk of the collection came in 2011 after the death of one of Lucier's longtime collaborators, Tiger Birch, who had been using it for his own research purposes. That brought the collection up to about 11 cubic feet. And in 2018, as Veronica was doing the related records notes for the finding aid, she found that our colleagues at the University of Alaska Fairbanks had an additional 2 cubic feet. And when contacting them to find out more about what that contained, they offered to send it to us. So the collection is now approximately 13 cubic feet. I mention this primarily because, as most of this audience will know, collections that come in very small pieces are often the most difficult to describe and contextualize, and they present enormous issues for the recognition of original order. In addition, when a large amount comes in but has been in the hands of another individual who may have arranged it for his own purposes and research projects, having the more extensive description can often assist in bypassing some of the issues created by the loss of original order and context. Next slide, please. We started tracking collection use for our collections in 2007. This chart does not include individual requests for collection images That's sourced from our online digital platform, as those are largely irrelevant to this project. We had 13 individual requests for the collection between 2007 and 2014, 12 during the period of time that the cohorts were working, and 23 in the period since, and that includes up to March of this year. These numbers are so small that I cannot call them statistically reliable, but I can talk a little bit about some interesting points. Of the two cohorts, on average, the students in the first cohort spent approximately an hour more over the semester working on their projects. And they also had a much larger range of time spent between the students, from 8 hours to 24 hours. At least 4 of the students returned after their cohort's work was done to do research in the collection, 3 of which were for other coursework, both undergraduate and graduate level. And in addition, one of those students also chose to transcribe a handwritten story in the collection for us, just out of personal interest. One of our concerns, specifically as archivists, was to ensure the outcome of the metadata edition, beyond opening up the collection, would open up the collection to the community more broadly. We wanted to make sure it would not skew use toward a specific discipline. And I understand that it's a little ridiculous of me to say that, given how little the original description we had actually opened up the collection at all, however. But even without a statistically reliable data set, it's clear to me that this project navigated that quite successfully. The use for members of the Native community, whether individuals researching their family or regional corporations looking at materials for cultural or other purposes, has definitely increased, as has the breadth of disciplines, discipline types of researchers accessing the materials, which includes economists, health professionals, primarily public health, and English students. Next slide, please.
At the time of teaching the course, we fully incorporated research ethics into all aspects of the class. And the materials we discussed, but we still relied on a collaborative format. During the first cohort, we didn't actually know what kind of data we will encounter. And as I mentioned, the volume, but also the richness of the data took us by surprise. For the second cohort, we were kind of more prepared, and we reached out to one of the regional corporations whose communities were represented in the collection to work with us, and this ended up being a successful collaboration. But in the past couple of years, the co-production of framework research has emerged from Alaska Native methodologies, and in part it emphasizes intentional collaboration and full engagement with communities from the planning stage to data dissemination. The co-production of knowledge framework was developed by Carolina Behe, Rachel Daniel, and Julie Raymond Kubian. And the little QR code you see there, if you scan that, it will take you to a presentation they have on the co-production of knowledge framework. They also have a paper that they actually published. And so the framework for co-production of knowledge in the context of working with Alaskan communities. So that's if you'd like, to have help finding it, we are happy to do that. We're happy to help you find that. So when we were working with Kawarak Inc., who was the corporation who came, they are also the one who has this presented on their website. Looking back now, we would use the co-production of knowledge framework for this kind of work, and to actually teach it to the students as well, so that we can better engage with Indigenous data sovereignty throughout the project.
In a discipline that often praises the use of open access and open data, it is important to consider how this affects Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, cultural property rights, and sensitive subject matter. Open data advocates often for the FAIR principles, which are findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets in order to make data easier to replicate in other research settings. To complement these FAIR principles while demonstrating more respect for Indigenous data governance, or the right for Indigenous peoples to determine how data about them and their culture is collected, shared, and stewarded, the CARE principles were developed to advocate for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. According to the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, the CARE principles are people and purpose-oriented, reflecting the crucial role of data in advancing Indigenous innovation and self-determination. And these CARE principles pair with the FAIR principles to encourage others to consider the human side of data stewardship.
So using the co-production of knowledge framework and CARE would have better for practicing Indigenous data governance. For example, in determining data sharing protocols and establishing relationships with all Alaska Native organizations who are represented in the collection. But developing these relationships take time. And while we did reach out to other corporations as well, we were not able to develop an intentional working relationship with them at that time. This doesn't mean that we wouldn't have been able to do so later on. Partially maybe by sharing the updated finding aid and the data we've been collecting. So as the co-production of knowledge framework clearly discusses, building and maintaining reciprocal and respectful relationships takes time. Next slide, please.
Some further reflections and recommendations for a class or project of this nature. I would recommend breaking up the heavy lifting heavy read and lift, at the beginning and start earlier in the archives, dispersing the readings throughout the semester. This would allow for more archival research experience and opportunities for check-ins with archive staff and just more time in general to dive deep into the collections. I would also highlight the interdisciplinary nature of archival work and how many different disciplines can benefit from what is inside these collections. As was mentioned earlier, in just the Lucier collection alone, topics range from music and drum making to biology and subsistence lifestyles and family stories to shop records and beyond. And amplifying that is something that can make this work go beyond the anthropology, archaeology class that we were targeting. In addition, I would advocate for amplifying the connection of archival research to heritage preservation to demonstrate to students the value.
And another interesting consideration that came up pertains to IRB. At the time when we were developing this collaboration and we were teaching the class, we did not think about presenting or publishing about our experiences. We were focused on achieving the learning goals and supporting the students in sharing their work. So we didn't go through IRB review, we didn't request it. As a result, none of the information or data we are sharing falls under IRB. For example, all the pictures and the screenshots are from publicly shared venues. This does have limitations, and we wish we would have had an IRB review so that we could share more details. So what we're recommending anyone thinking about a similar collaboration is to start thinking about IRB early on and perhaps in parallel of developing the collaboration.
I think it's also important to recognize that this is a partnership between the archives and the instructor of the course. It's important for the professor of the course to understand at least the basic principles of archival research and archival description, and also that the archivist understands that at even a basic level, the topics in the course. So in this instance, ethnohistory. The onus of a project like this shouldn't be just on the archivist or just on the instructor of the class. It should be a collaborative partnership between the two.
discuss this briefly about reaching out to the Native communities and the corporations in the area. She's absolutely right, but I also have to acknowledge our own responsibility that, quite frankly, we should have done that much earlier. We have been looking much more strongly since at getting in contact with communities represented by materials that are hopefully at least at the point at which we do some initial description of the collection, but preferably when it walks in the door, if at all possible, if we know it's coming ahead of that. And I think that would have given us a better starting point once the class started, or the class we were preparing for the class, to have some of those relationships already in place. Next slide, please.
So some more of the lessons learned specifically on the archive side of things, that this kind of project does take a lot of time. There's a lot of archivist time spent speaking to the students, having the students learn about the metadata and archival description, what metadata is, what they're going to be doing. I wish that I had given them a reading on metadata, or like how to describe archival collections, just so that they had some fundamental knowledge, so that could help them. I think they did well, but I think that initial reading could have really helped build more of that confidence with the students. The second cohort was bigger, was a little bit bigger than the first cohort. And so that took up a lot of space in the research room, and a lot of the times it couldn't just be on just myself helping the students. My colleagues there in the archives also helped the students, especially in the beginning, because in the first like 2 or 3 weeks, the students had a lot of questions, and eventually as they grew more confident in what they were doing, they didn't really need us anymore. But for the first like 2 or 3 weeks, it did take a lot of time of myself and my colleagues. And also, if there's unexpected outages too, it's good that your colleagues are completely in the loop of what is happening. And then also editing the finding aid took a long time. It's now like a 90-page document, and it was very hard to get the students to follow like good standards like capitalization and putting a semicolon in between words and terms. So I can't even tell you how many semicolons I had to add, because sometimes they put a comma, and the comma, I don't know, it was just confusing. Anyways, it just took a lot of time. And then they also would add too much description to the folders, which for the class, they did have to do a summary of the folders because they were also learning. But that summary wasn't supposed to go into the finding aid. A lot of times they would put that summary in the finding aid, and they'd use phrases like interesting. So we did have to cut that down. And then a few times I had to pull the collection to look at the documents to make sure what they put was correct, to make sure that the spellings that they used were correct. And I will say that the Google Doc definitely made the project easier. I only wish that we thought about breaking the finding aid into multiple Google Docs, and I don't know why we didn't think about it at the time, because that seems pretty like common sense, but we did not. And so by the end, we were working with a very long document with multiple people editing it, and that was just a nightmare the last couple of weeks. But I would totally do this again too. It's given me a lot more confidence as an archivist to just give a collection to students and have them look at it and do research. I think, you know, we should give students more benefit of the doubt sometimes, and they do really well. And yeah, I would totally do something like this again.
And so the last lessons learned, and I'm pretty sure you all already know this, but students are fantastic, and they're resourceful and they're creative. And so they find ways to make use of their new archival skills and ethnohistorical research skills for new goals and tasks. So at some point, we were barely able to keep up with them, and we realized it would have been helpful to have resources already available and listed that's available at the university that would support them in using their new skills in these new research ways. So that would be maybe partially a recommendation to think about that and collect that information before the semester starts and incorporate it into the course. Next slide, please. So as final thoughts, one thing we learned when we started working together on the article, so this was years and years and years after the second cohort already finished the class. So one thing we learned from our shared reflection is that at some point, the archive's needs eventually will diverge from the course's needs in terms that go beyond learning research skills and how to use archives. Can I please have one more click? And one more click, please. Thank you. So for the archives, producing accurate metadata is the goal in this collaboration, and that so that it can enhance the finding aid. But for the course and the instructor and the students, the end goal is to learn doing ethnohistorical work. Well, in this particular case, I mean, another course might have another goal, but to learn that subject actually, and to produce and analyze research data. So recognizing these differences will actually help scale the expectations in this collaboration. Ultimately, that will lead to a much better collaboration.
And one of the things that as archivists, we discussed, my colleagues and I, was about we were worried that putting too much description in the finding aid would kind of ruin the context of the collection and the researcher context. So we were worried that it would have researchers kind of like just hone in on like one folder because they see all this description in there and they think, oh, like this is the only folder that I need. It's likely not anywhere else, right? We wanted them to still, you know, do good research within the collection. But I think without having a lot of the summaries in there and just sticking to the overarching topics and themes within the folders, I don't think that really happened. I think that researchers, based on what Arlene said, are still really are utilizing the collection in a way that I don't think that we, as we did this, really even thought. Like we hoped that it would bring about more discoverability of the collection, and I guess it did.
Okay, thank you so much, Veronica, Dia, and Arlene and Alex for your presentation. We do have a couple of microphones, and I noticed that there were a couple of questions on the Q&A as well. So if anybody has questions, we can pass the microphone around. Because we're on Zoom, there's like an interesting delay. So we will have you ask a question and then we'll pause for a minute so they can switch the audio so that they can speak to us. But then if we have another question, like a follow-up question, maybe just pause for a second so that we can make sure that we're able to reduce the echoing as much as possible. So any questions in this room? Well, I have some starting questions to hopefully get us started. So one of the things that I wanted to ask in the article, you mentioned kind of the reasons that you chose the Lucier project, but do you have any recommendations about how to choose collections for projects like this and what parameters you used to pick this collection?
Speak for Maida. I know between this and other classes, and Veronica, please jump in. Our goal was to have something that was relevant to the class. So every time a professor approaches us and wants to do something similar to this, or even just have their students work in the archives, I hope, and thankfully Maida was very congenial with this, that they work with us to select materials or to give us enough information to select materials that are truly relevant to the course's needs.
I want to add to that, because I had recently redescribed and added that addition to the collection, it was kind of in my mind. But I also had received like 3 reference requests in like the months after I did that, there's a student on campus who wanted to look at the collection, and they were looking for like shamanism and like medicine. And I knew it was in there because I had seen several documents with it or within the collection, but the student didn't want to have to go through the whole collection and do this in-depth research. And then we had another reference request from someone from an indigenous from one of the native corporations, and she was really into it. Like, she was definitely like looking through the collection and getting a lot of interesting stuff from the collection. And I realized that as far as collections in the archival holdings at UAA go, this one was probably the better one of the collections that verge on anthropology and archaeology to have students work in as well. I think it was the better collection of the ones that we had there. And I realized that the students could really learn a lot of information from the indigenous community. It's like the collection was from the indigenous community itself, instead of an outside anthropologist coming in, taking the materials or putting their own biases into the things like having them being the ones translating the stories, as opposed to in the Lucier collection. And many of the stories are dictated and translated by Inupiaq. And so that was kind of a little different than the other ones.
And it's all true. And I wanted to add that the way this looked, actually what happened, I went into the archives, we sat down with Veronica, we talked a little bit about the goals of the class, and she told me about several collections. And I think there was one more collection we considered, but that was heavily photograph based. There were some actually documents, and we started running around looking at the collection and getting our hands in there, trying to understand how would that work for students to, try to get the data out of it and try to actually learn the process as well. And so we decided to go with the Lucier because for this particular course, ethnohistory, the heavily photograph-based collection, I think was actually also, there were some HIPAA restrictions because it was a hospital, photographs from a hospital in Alaska. And so we didn't want to focus on that, but I could see for a health class or, a photography class or something like that, that would actually be a good choice. So I think we worked together really hard to find the ideal kind of cross-section that fits in there.
First, I want to thank everybody for their wonderful presentation. And hi, Arlene, it's good to see you again. It's been a lot of years. I wished I was going to had the time to come visit your institution while I'm in Alaska this summer. I'm trying to figure out how to do it now. But anyway, do you have a bibliography or something of some of the work that they have used your collections? I'm fascinated to learn more about how it's being used and about some of the, with the publications.
We don't have a bibliography. We often don't know. Yeah, obviously we encourage people who have been doing research, and we tell them when they're doing research that it's important for them to let us know when it's used, so we can tell the resource allocators that there is a value to supporting us. But honestly, most of the time we honestly don't hear. So when we do know, we do push that out in several ways. But do we have a complete bibliography? No.
And I just want to mention that in the article in the Journal of Western Archives, they do mention some of the papers that were presented by the students who worked in the collections. So those are also some ways that you can see how the collection's been used. I was also kind of wondering if you have received any feedback from the communities that this collection represents, some of the indigenous communities this collection represents, and how they feel about the expanded metadata. I know that there have been more requests from some of the tribes for this collection, but is there any other further feedback that you've received about the metadata that's now present in this collection?
So I think it was it after the second cohort, in between the first and second cohort, myself and 3 students from the class presented at the Alaska Native Studies Conference that was held at UAA. And there were several Indigenous individuals within that presentation, some of which who knew Charles was here. And none of the feedback was negative. They all seemed really, it was mostly like mostly interested in like what the students learned. And they thought that it was a really interesting project that was done. But I'm trying to remember now, that was a long time ago, but that's what I can remember. I don't know if anyone has contacted the archives more recently. But.
And actually after that presentation, I think I decided to go over to the archive collectively from the presentation room, which was on the other side of the campus. And so many of the folks who were from communities were present in the room, and we just walked over to the archive and started looking at the archival boxes and the information that was collected.
Yeah, Willie Hensley came. Sorry. He walked over with us. I remember that now. Yeah, that did happen.
All right, well,
I have a question.
yes.
I just was curious. In the article, you discuss how challenging it was to kind of reassess as you went along it's weird to see me up there talk at the same time. All right, I'm not looking. Anyway, you discuss that, gosh, that really threw me off. I'm sorry. That while students will learn to do ethnohistorical and archival research, the ability to reach specific research goals will be limited, and producing a complete full-fledged study will be almost certainly too ambitious, which I totally get. How were you able to kind of adapt to just the very nature of doing this kind of research while also describing the collection when there's research dead ends and the kind of the things that happen during the research process that slow things down? How are you able to adapt to that?
Yeah, yes, that was absolutely true. We had all these great plans for for publications that the students would be authors on, and we would support them. And I realized a 3 credit course, that's just not enough. We should have had at least, like a lab, one more credit at least, so that we have time to be in the archives. I mean, we all know archival research takes a very, very long time, and then double that. And then that's how you need to work with that. And so actually, it was interesting to see because students adapted. And so that's when we started seeing all this interest of, I'm going to use this skill to do this project, and I'm going to go present. And so we were able to connect them with Apex, the Apex conference, and Alex was actually presenting on that. And now she is the co-lead on the US Apex side, actually, after all these years, and she was presented in there. But so they took it to different areas. They presented at other conferences, and they used it for their other, their ME thesis and their other projects. And so I think just scrambling to find those supports for them. And a lot of the times we didn't even know until after they came back and reported back to us. I think one thing we noticed, and this was wonderful to see, we would see that students are a lot more comfortable coming into the archives and working with the archival collection. And, actually at UAA, the archives are glass, right? Like one wall is totally glass. And so it was lovely to come in and see that it was full when we were there and working with the collections. So if anybody's thinking about doing this, I would definitely consider more credits, a larger credit class, or paring down the expectations and being very clear with students that, okay, you can get data out of it, but we probably won't have the time to write it up. So maybe it's like a back-to-back class or something that building on each other along those lines. That's what I would.
Alex, I have a question for you. So in the article, and you mentioned it in the presentation as well, you talk about being really worried about being able to represent the collection and kind of get rid of your own biases and be able to describe it the right way. I'm just wondering kind of what your process was, and I know it was a long time ago, so this might be a difficult question to answer, but like, what was your process, or how did you gain the confidence to kind of remove those biases to represent the Indigenous knowledge that you were finding in the collection more accurately?
Yeah, thank you for that. To my best recollection, when we had, pages and pages of notes, and there was just so much data right there. And I think the biggest thing that really helped ground it was the fact that we had to be so succinct in that finding aid. And we had to pull out just these key facts. But then, as Veronica mentioned, we were also encountering places where the words that were recommended by the Library of Congress, or whichever the guidelines are, they just didn't quite fit. And so it was like, how do we, make sure that we're representing this Indigenous data in a way that's, culturally relevant, and then, but also making it accessible within the finding aid. And I felt like I was leaving out a lot of information, but was reminded that this is a finding aid. It's not meant to, I can't rewrite everything all over again, because that would, it would be counterintuitive to what the project was. So it just took a lot of like self-reflecting and going back over my own work to make sure that I had those key points. And I erred on the side of maybe I would add 1 or 2 more details than were needed. And who knows, maybe Veronica edited it out in the end, and I'm just ignorant to the fact that it could have been cut out. But it was definitely an interesting challenge to work in that way.
There was a question in the Q&A about.
We have a question online.
Yes.
Katie asks, can you speak to how you handle public access to restricted archaeological information?
So, and I'll hand it over to Veronica and Arlene as they talk about the collection. In this specific case, I think this is where the co-correctional knowledge framework would have been really useful, even though we did have collaboration. And we, of course, taught our students that archaeological sites can be endangered if the locations are, the exact locations are revealed. So they, when we work with communities, they request that they protect it, so we can give a general area where the site is, but not a very specific one, so that people who shouldn't be there, who don't have authorization, who don't have permission from the tribes to come, don't go there. There's no looting. The same thing with some of the natural resource sites as well, actually. And so we were very conscious of this, and when we work with the collection, and we have somebody from one of the regional corporations come and talk with the students, go around and talk with the students and answer these type of questions. And I'll hand it over to Veronica and Arlene in generally answering that.
It was one of the reasons we also chose this collection for this project, because quite frankly, he wasn't doing a ton of archaeological work. That was a very brief period in his career. The majority of it was ethnographic work, which dovetailed with the class much more closely. So yes, there's larger answers to be given there. There's larger questions, far more questions to be asked there. But within the constraints of this particular collection, it has not been an enormous issue.
I believe his archaeological work on the sites was over 2 years, but I don't recall how much is actually mentioned in the ethnographic journals from that time period. I think most of the ethnographic journals are him speaking with the Indigenous communities about their stories and their lives and experiences rather than archaeological sites. I know that it's mentioned, they are mentioned a couple of times, but it's not a huge part of that collection. And I don't even recall if he mentioned specifically where those sites are.
Thank you again to our presenters for joining us from all over the country this morning. And thank you everyone for being here and participating.
Thank you so much.